Start the Middle Class Prosperity Project Forum. So why is the Middle Class Prosperity Project holding a hearing on the importance of federal funding for research? The reasons are three, and they are all deeply interrelated and related to the future of America's middle class. Investments in research produce good jobs right here in America. Breakthroughs in research are our best chance to keep from bankrupting our country and from bankrupting the entire middle class, keeping us from going broke over Alzheimer's, diabetes, and all of the other costs of medical care. And research will give us a chance to live better lives. American innovation has changed the world. Scientific advances like supercomputers, the internet, sequencing the human genome, and treatments for polio, cancer, and HIV have saved lives and created good jobs for middle-class America. Economists agree that advances in science and technology have been, quote, the predominant driver of GDP growth over the past half-century. Today, 2.7 million Americans work in jobs focused on scientific research, and many, many more are employed by the companies built from new discoveries and technological innovations, companies like Google and Facebook. For every dollar invested in the National Institutes of Health, for example, we get about $2.20 back in immediate economic activity. You know, private industry is great at generating new inventions based on scientific developments that have a clear application. But basic research, the kind whose applications aren't clear yet, doesn't get so much investment, and that's where we need government. Government provides patient capital, the kind that can wait for long-term results. An American president once said that, quote, although basic research does not begin with a particular practical goal, when you look at the results over the years, it turns out being one of the most practical things government does. That president was Ronald Reagan, a fiscal conservative who understood the value of investing in American innovation. For decades, investments in science has been a bipartisan priority. But today's Washington has lost sight of that priority. Everyone, Republicans and Democrats, say that investing in science and innovation is a good idea, but talk is cheap. We need action, and we haven't had any in a very long time. One proposal moving through Congress is the 21st Century Cures Act, which includes about $1.9 billion a year for 5 years in new funding for NIH. Now that sounds like a good start, and it is, but it's not nearly enough. Today's NIH budget, adjusted for inflation, is $12.5 billion less than it was in 2003. That is a 25% reduction in our federal investment in NIH alone. Even worse, the bill doesn't include a maintenance of effort provision, which means there's nothing to stop Congress from cutting the NIH's base budget at the same time that it adds new money on top. If that happened, instead of expanding, our investment in the NIH under this bill could actually shrink. Now, earlier this year, I introduced the Medical Innovation Act, which would help rebuild the NIH budget. It could boost NIH funding by about 20%. And it achieves that increase without raising taxes, without gutting vital programs, and without adding to the deficit. Dozens of doctor organizations, of patient groups, and of scientific associations have supported it, and there's no reason that every Republican, every Democrat, and every independent in Congress couldn't support it too. Now, members of Congress are responsible for deciding whether we make these investments in our future or whether we just talk about them. The American people deserve better from Congress, and that's why we're holding this forum today, to have a real discussion about what we can and should do to get more money into research. I am very pleased that we have Speaker Gingrich here to talk about his work to increase federal investments in health science research and to talk about what it takes to make real, effective, bipartisan progress. There are many things that the Speaker and I disagree on, But we strongly agree that investment in research is a fundamental responsibility of our elected leaders, and that it is long past time to meet that responsibility. We also have a distinguished panel of researchers, economists, and innovators who will talk about how increased funding creates jobs and strengthens the economy, and how Congress can do a better job of prioritizing federal investment in science. Dr. Espy-Wilson, Dr. Kesselheim, and Dr. Mazzucato, thank you. I am very glad that you are here, and I look forward to today's conversation. Congressman Cummings, would you like to make a few remarks?
Thank you very much, Senator Warren. It's an honor to join for this, the sixth forum we've convened as part of the Middle Class Prosperity Project. Today, we will examine how our nation's investments in research and development have charted the path of progress for our economy over 7 decades since the end of World War II, creating millions of middle-class jobs in the process. We will also examine how cuts to these investments and unpredictability in funding for research and development threaten our future progress. American ingenuity is unmatched in the history of the world. The United States harnessed creativity, and we help new discoveries leap from the lab to the marketplace in a way that is the envy of countries all over the globe. According to the Congressional Research Service, the federal government is the nation's largest supporter of basic research. It funded more than half of basic research in the United States in 2012. As a result of funding appropriated by Congress, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Defense, and other agencies award tens of thousands of research grants every year. Federal funding through programs like the Small Business Innovation Research program have been critical to help researchers and entrepreneurs convert the promising results of basic scientific research into new products and technologies that improve the lives of millions of people while creating entirely new industries and the jobs that come with them. In 1961, President Kennedy called on Americans to make a major national commitment of scientific and technical manpower, material, and facilities. As a result of that commitment, the United States became the first and only nation to put astronauts on the moon. We reaped the benefits of the discoveries that were made through the space program in the form of technologies and products that were never imagined when we began the lunar exploration effort. Similarly, our nation's leading role in the 13-year effort to decode the human genome has led to new treatments for some of our most devastating diseases. This advancement also created enormous benefits. According to Battelle Memorial Institute, our government's investment in $3.8 billion in the Human Genome Project helped generate an economic impact of $796 billion between 1998 and 2010. This is a massive return on investment of 14 to 1. The question before our nation now is, what story will we write in the 21st century? Will it be one of stunning new accomplishment, scientific progress, and continued economic growth? Or will it be one which we decide we can no longer afford the next big discovery? Will we remain the world's leader in scientific research and development? Or will we succumb to a culture of mediocrity and watch as other nations outpace our investments, our discoveries, and our progress? In 2009, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act contributed more than $20 billion to the existing federal research and development budget. In 2013, however, sequestration intensified a series of steep cuts that began shortly after the Recovery Act was passed. According to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, our nation's federal research and development budget declined by more than $26 billion from 2010 to 2015. That's a drop of 16%. These cuts and the uncertainty our research institutions face have had devastating impact on research initiatives. These cuts are shrinking the pipeline from which discoveries and inventions will emerge 10 or even 20 years from now. The decisions we are making from the short-term perspective of the annual budget cycle are shaping the nation and the economy we will leave to our children. We need to make sure that they inherit a country that continues to lead in scientific innovation, that creates a better world and a strong economy, and that promotes a broad and prosperous middle class. I am pleased to join Senator Warren in welcoming Speaker Gingrich to today's forum. I served with Speaker Gingrich during my first terms in Congress, and I thank him for his leadership on the issue of investing in biomedical research. I also welcome our distinguished members of the second panel. We have an extraordinary group of experts assembled today, and it is an honor to have this opportunity to hear from each of you. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman. We are honored to welcome the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich, to today's forum. Please come down. Congressman Gingrich. It's good to see you here. Congressman Gingrich represented Georgia's 6th Congressional District from 1979 to 1999. From 1995 to 1999, he was the 58th Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Madam, I just want to make one note. I join you, Senator Warren, in welcoming Speaker Gingrich to today's forum. Not only did I serve with Speaker Gingrich, but I failed to say that he gave my parents one of the greatest thrills of their life, them with both of my parents having less than a 6th grade education, having been former sharecroppers from Manning, South Carolina. You, Speaker Gingrich, swore me in a special election. And you took a moment after the swearing in to speak to my parents, and I shall forever be grateful. Thank you, and welcome.
Would you like to start?
No, he's going to start.
Oh, he's going to start. Good. Speaker Gingrich.
Well, let me thank both of you, and let me say, as a fellow member of the House, Congressman Cummings, that I'm delighted to have had that opportunity, and I appreciate your bringing your parents. I think it's one of those magic moments, the first time you get sworn in and the whole family's there, and it means a lot. And thank you, Senator Warren, and thank you for rushing back. I can appreciate how hectic your schedule is. So when you first called me, I was frankly both surprised and delighted, and I'm glad to be here. I'm really delighted to be here to discuss federal funding for research and development, a topic that has the potential to transform the lives of millions of Americans of all backgrounds, and clearly to bring together liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans. Before I offer a few general principles for how to think about federal research and development funding, let me start with an example that is close to my heart, and that is finding cures for the most common and serious health problems. This is a challenge that is important, it is urgent, and now there is great hope that it's doable. It's important because every one of us has been touched by the devastating effects of problems like Alzheimer's disease, dementia, cancer, kidney disease, and Parkinson's. We know how debilitating they can be, how they absorb the energies of family members and caretakers, how they strain the finances of even well-off families. From a fiscal as well as a human perspective, finding cures for these diseases is urgent. Former Senator Bob Kerrey and I chaired the Alzheimer's Study Group for 3 years. We learned that over the next 4 decades, Americans will spend $20 trillion on Alzheimer's and other dementias. That is more than a full year's gross domestic product. So imagine all the money in the country for an entire year would go just to this. The taxpayers are on the hook for much of it, including an estimated 420% increase in cost to Medicare and 330% increase in cost to Medicaid. And these, of course, are just 2 out of many programs. The federal funding for research to cure Alzheimer's is only a tiny fraction of the money the government is already spending to treat Alzheimer's every year. The NIH spent $731 million on dementia research this year, less than 1/2 of 1% of the $154 billion Medicare and Medicaid are spending to treat it in the same period. Part of the reason for the imbalance is that National Institutes of Health funding has been cut more than 20% in real terms since 2003, the end of the 5-year doubling of the NIH budget, which we achieved on a bipartisan basis in the 1990s. Given the costs we know are coming, boosting research funding may be the most fiscally responsible step we can take. And I want to emphasize this for a second. It's probably one of the places where I do bring a little bit of a unique background. We balanced the federal budget for 4 straight years, the only time in your lifetime the federal budget's been balanced for 4 straight years. We did it while doubling the NIH budget because we set priorities. But I want to make a deeper point about the future. With the baby boomers aging, if we do not find a research-based solution, we will never balance the federal budget because we will never impose the level of regulatory pain that it would take to balance the budget, which really means people not getting treated, people being in miserable circumstances. And remember that with Alzheimer's, caretakers are twice as likely to be sick as non-caretakers. So you not only have the Alzheimer's population, you have the caretaker population, both at risk because of this. The good news is curing Alzheimer's and other major diseases appears more doable today than any time in history, thanks in no small part to basic research and development funded by the federal government. We're in a period of extraordinary breakthroughs in biology, genetics, computation, and materials. National Institute of Health in general, and frankly, Tom Insall in particular, have shown real leadership with the BRAIN Initiative. And today, NIH is pioneering the development of things like immunotherapies, which are spurring patients' immune systems to attack diseases like cancer rather than relying on surgery, chemotherapy, or radiation. To allow research funding to languish at a time of historic opportunity when we could be saving lives and saving money takes a special kind of stupidity that is reserved for this city. I should note as an exception to this criticism the great work of Chairman Upton, Congresswoman DeGette, and their colleagues in the House, whose 21st Century Cures initiative is one of the most important and bipartisan efforts in Congress in recent years. And I know that over here, in addition to Senator Warren's initiative, the Senators Lamar Alexander and Ron Johnson are working very hard in the same direction. In addition to drastic increases in research funding, I've called for doubling the NIH budget. And I would, by the way, also include a substantial increase in the National Science Foundation, which I think was the one mistake we made in research funding. We should have tripled NSF, which is much smaller, when we doubled NIH. Let me quickly offer 2 bold, big ideas about research and development at the federal level. The first is research bonds. For large, very expensive projects with the potential to generate huge savings if they work, it is worth exploring issuing bonds to finance the research, which would then pay out some fraction of the savings. This would have the benefit of taking important projects off budget and raising much larger sums of money than the federal government is likely to appropriate. We currently are developing this idea for brain research bonds with Garen Staglin and Pete Corelli at OneMind, as well as Professor Steve Hyman at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. Congressman Michael Burgess and Andy Harris in the House have proposed a version of this idea with the MIND Act for Alzheimer's research bonds. Similar models could apply to large infrastructure investments, as Governors Mitch Daniels, John Kasich, Pete Wilson, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Mike Leavitt have all demonstrated with innovative strategies for financing major roadways in their states. Philip Howard has argued that if we simply rationalized the absurdly bureaucratic review processes for infrastructure, we could create 3 million more jobs with the same appropriation. Finally, for research and development that returns less obvious savings to the taxpayer, but might nonetheless be worthwhile, I'm a big supporter of prizes. Prizes are good for a couple of reasons. First, taxpayers don't pay a thing unless and until the goal is actually achieved, and they never pay more than the prize amount. Second, you get lots of competing strategies for solving the problem when you have multiple groups working independently to get the prize. This competition means you get better results that are far more efficient than cost-plus contracting, and that you may end up with several working designs. I would radically reorient many of our efforts in space and transportation and procurement around prizes to accelerate the competition and the development. With that sort of sweeping overview, I look forward to your questions.
Speaker Gingrich, I want to thank you for your insightful presentation. You know, you argued, and I quote, that it's irresponsible and short-sighted, not prudent, to let financing for basic research dwindle. What do you think are the main reasons we have let financing for basic research dwindle?
Well, I think there are probably two or three big reasons. One is that the past has lobbyists and the future has publicists. And in this city, lobbyists often beat publicists. So when you look at resource allocation, some programs that may not be nearly as important or nearly as justified have a lot better lobbying, and they survive. That's an objective fact. Second, I think that there are those fiscal conservatives who are sort of anti-government in a way that makes no sense. It's a little bit like the woman who once wrote Wernher von Braun and said, quit trying to go to the moon, stay home and watch television the way God intended. There are people who have no notion of the power of the government, whether it's the jet airplane you ride as a passenger, or it's the computer you're using, or it's the internet, or it's 1,000 different things. Government investment in this country from the very beginning, we're the only country in the world that created a patent office in its constitution. We were founded by people who believe in the future, and there's a branch of conservatism that doesn't get it. And then third, I'd be candid, I think we've allowed welfare state spending and other bureaucratic spending to crowd out investment. If you go back and look at the percent of the size of the government that we were spending on investment in research, investment in infrastructure 30 or 40 years ago, it was dramatically bigger than now. All this has to be changed. And one of the reasons I'm for something like Alzheimer's bonds is I don't think we're going to win the fight. You know, we'll make some incremental progress. But compared to the size of the tidal wave of illness that's coming down the road as people age, we are not going to get ahead of it within the traditional incremental appropriations process. And that's why I've looked for some way to break out, as I suggested, with taking it off budget and issuing bonds that would be retired as we gain the savings of people not getting sick.
I'm going to come back to Alzheimer's in a minute, but didn't some of the things that you just stated exist back then when you were able to double the budget with regard to research? I mean, there's some significant thing that changed. And the reason why I'm asking that is I'm trying to figure out how we can get back to where you want us to get to.
I think something sort of magic happened when we were in the first stages of trying to balance the federal budget, and John Kasich, as chairman, had the lead in that project. And it was a huge, huge project. And Congressman John Porter, who had spent his entire career on NIH problems, and Senator Connie Mack, who had a very family-based concern with cancer throughout his entire family history, both came to see us, and they brought with them every vice president for research of every pharmaceutical in the country. And we had a meeting of about 70 people, and they said, look, this is a function of jobs, as Senator Warren said. You want really high-value American jobs, you invest in basic research. You want to really have the most competitive economy on the planet, you invest in basic research. You want to have the best national security in the world, you invest in basic research. Those things have carried us for 150 years, and it is a period of utter foolishness to walk away from the things that have worked. And that also means, candidly, those of us who are conservative, as I am, have to win the argument with other conservatives about the centrality of government investment. You know, I always point out to people that the Transcontinental Railroad was built with a huge government incentive. I mean, it didn't happen randomly. And even Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations argues that there are times and places for national security reasons when government should be basically shaping the market. And I would argue that the areas you and I are talking about are a key part of that. But I give John Porter and Connie Mack a great deal of credit for having made it possible for us to build the momentum to double NIH's budget.
You know, as federal funding has dwindled, I'm just curious, has private sector funding increased to fill the gap? Sometimes you hear that argument that the private sector should be doing more.
Well, look, there's some areas of private sector activity that you can see where there's been an investment. But there are two things that operate against that. The first is that Wall Street is very, very one quarter at a time minded. So the analysts don't look at, the great age of Bell Labs, for example. The analysts would not look at a 20-year investment strategy and give you a very good mark. So most CEOs are really driven by the finance system towards short-term optimization in a way which undermines the kind of investment you're describing. But there's a second part to this. And most economists agree with this. I don't think there's much doubt. When you're talking about fundamental breakthroughs, everybody has an incentive to hope somebody else will pay for it. That's just an objective reality. And frankly, if it's a big breakthrough, I mean, the jet engine is probably as good an example as any. Jet engines were really complicated and really experimental in 1939 to 45. You weren't going to get those created without massive government investment. Once we had built good enough jet engines for the B-47 and the B-52, it was pretty easy to build the Boeing 707. But without the Air Force's investment in that kind of engine capability, you couldn't have had the transfer into commercial activities. So I think you have to be honest about, what will the private sector really invest in? And when you start talking about very long-term things, and by the way, we've had a wonderful history of philanthropy. I'm a big fan of the American Museum of Natural History, which was founded by private citizens, funded by private citizens, is still largely funded by private citizens, and that's terrific. But if you're talking about the scale of science that we need, particularly in national security and in dealing with health, you're not going to get that either from philanthropy or from for-profit companies.
Just one more question. I was stunned to read in the MIT report that over just the past 2 years, the FDA has approved 19 new cancer drugs. But over the past decade, and I quote, not a single new drug for Alzheimer's disease has been approved. And I guess based on what you just said, it would be almost impossible for the private sector to make that breakthrough with regard to Alzheimer's without a lot of government help. Is that a faith?
That's partially true. The other thing I would say, to go out on a limb here for a second, is I think we need to really rethink how the FDA works. Example, if you're dealing with a lifetime condition, you can't afford to test a drug that takes 20 years to figure out whether or not you're going to legalize it. You'll never raise the capital to invest in a drug that has a 20 or 30-year time horizon of getting approved. And when you get into brain science, you're in a different, the FDA is not today scientifically prepared to deal with the complexities of, and this is also true for regenerative medicine. I mean, there are whole zones that are happening in science that we are not bureaucratically prepared to understand and to do. So I'd say it's a dual thing. The government has to make the investment, but candidly, we could dramatically accelerate getting investment in new drugs, and we could dramatically accelerate getting, particularly, for example, Alzheimer-related things, many of which are going to have to be conditional. I mean, if you're dealing with a 20 or 30-year process, you have to say, we don't see any immediate safety problem. Those of you who want to have informed consent, do it, because the truth is we're not going to know for a generation whether or not it works.
Thank you very much. Senator Warren?
Thank you, Congressman Cummings. And thank you very much, Speaker Gingrich, for being here. Thank you for your remarks. I could have given your testimony on the importance of public support for basic research, and I'm delighted to hear you talk about tripling the NSF budget. I strongly agree with you on this. But I want to focus for just a minute on the National Institutes of Health. Now, this is the crown jewel of medical research, supporting the work of more than 300,000 researchers, including 145 Nobel Prize winners, at more than 2,500 institutions. This work expands our understanding of biomedical science, leads to new drugs, new technologies, saves money, and saves lives. For decades, Congress increased the NIH budget year over year over year. And then in the late 1990s, both parties worked together to double that budget. You were the architect of that historic achievement. Now, I think it should be a lesson for today's Congress. You know, a lot of people think that we are far too partisan to get much of anything done, but I don't think anyone would describe the late 1990s as the golden age of nonpartisanship. Despite that, you successfully built bipartisan coalitions to support NIH funding. You got it done, so that's what I want to ask about. Despite the deep divides, why was it that members of both parties decided that NIH funding was so important in the late 1990s?
I think there were three things involved. And I'm partially thinking through it's a very good question. The first is,
I get paid for
as Hillary Clinton has said on the campaign trail, her husband and I had a technique where we could fight all morning and negotiate all evening. And I think it's really important to understand, it's not that you get to a nonpartisan, perfect world, but you have to place the country above whatever your fights are, and you have to say, okay, and Reagan and O'Neill did this brilliantly. I mean, you have to say, okay, now that we've both gotten it out of our system, what can we do? Let's not talk about what we're not going to do. What can we do? So I think in that sense, the President, Clinton and I had a bias in favor of finding solutions. Second, we did have remarkably strong corporate support. And that allowed us to overcome a lot of the conservative bias against government because you had people who were vice presidents. And you can imagine today, if you took the biological companies in the San Diego area and the biological companies around MIT and Harvard, and every one of those CEOs showed up down here. Forget Big Pharma for a second, because that is its own political, but you'd have so many hundred CEOs, almost all of them with Ph.D.s or M.D.s, saying, look, you want us to have good jobs and you want us to be able to solve problems, we got to do this. So we were able to bring a private sector energy to getting more money for the public sector. I think the third thing was we were able to engage a lot of the constituency groups who have a direct immediate interest. I mean, we had people, I remember when Bob Kerrey and I had spent the 3 years on a bipartisan basis on the Alzheimer's study group, and we were here in the Senate, we had 15 or 18 senators come to a hearing, and I think all but 2 of them had a personal relationship with Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. Well, suddenly you had people going, okay, let me get this straight. It's going to create jobs. It's the right thing to do for disease. And it's the only possible strategy to balance the federal budget. And somehow that conversation broke through. I mean, I'm frankly trying to figure out how we get it into the presidential campaign next year, because I would love to have the candidates have to answer the question, are you prepared, are you going to try to get to a balanced budget by bureaucratically depriving people of goods and services, or are you going to try to invest in the research that lets us break free? Because the truth is, it won't take, if you postpone Alzheimer's onset by 5 years, you cut the projection in half. Now, that's $10 trillion. So there are not many places you can turn and say, I think I can take $10 trillion out of the spending stream in a positive way by keeping you healthier.
So let me just follow up on this, though, now. Speaker Gingrich, you're a conservative and as a result may have a little more credibility than I do in some circles on the question of the role of government here. Why isn't it enough to count on private industry to do this? Why do we have to have a substantial investment from the federal government?
Yeah, it's a question about American history. Calista and I are currently developing an entire project on why George Washington matters. And people don't often notice that the Founding Fathers wrote into the Constitution a patent office because they so deeply believed in the future. They made investments. The first federal highway was built during Washington's lifetime. They believed in improving things. They talked about them as improvements. Jefferson launches an expedition to the West, which, by the way, and Calista done a children's book on this called From Sea to Shining Sea. It's supposed to cost about $2,800. It ends up costing $35,000. So there's certain patterns that don't seem to ever quite change. But the idea in Jefferson's era of taking a group of people and sending them all the way to the Pacific is comparable to going to Mars today. And yet Jefferson understood we needed the knowledge, most of which is now still stored up at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. So I think we've had a very long history of investment. The Congress passed the money to enable the first telegraph to be built between the Capitol and Baltimore. That was a congressional investment. Now, I think that we have to recognize, Lincoln, by the way, is the only president to actually hold a patent. And Lincoln was totally fascinated with technology and brought a lot of it into the Civil War to the benefit of the Union. So I think there's a long history of America being a country of technological advance, being willing to invest in a better future, and recognizing that government had a significant role to play in that.
And let me ask that with just a little more sharpness to the point right now on healthcare in particular. Given that the taxpayers are on the hook for Medicare, for the Veterans Administration, for other healthcare costs, if we fail to make the investments in NIH and discover the cures that we need, who's ultimately going to pay for this?
Well, let me try to paint a picture for a second, because it's worse than your question. Anybody who goes out and talks to cutting-edge scientists knows that we are right at the edge of breakthroughs that are so extraordinary. I'm now of an age where I have several friends who have unique, difficult problems. And when I can help them find the best 2 or 3 people in the country, their lives are suddenly transformed, because the best 2 or 3 people in the country are 20 years ahead and are doing things in laboratories and doing things in hospitals that are like magic. And we're having breakthroughs at every single level of health. To know that that exists, to know that we're this close in regenerative medicine, that within a generation we should be able to have, to help you regrow your own liver rather than have a transplant, to help you regrow your kidney so you don't have to have insulin injected for the rest of your life, to help you regrow if you're in a car wreck, to be able to regrow your nervous system, which we now have experiments with. And you see these things in the lab. And then you look at what's happening to a wounded warrior, because the science we are applying is 20 years behind the science that's in the laboratory. And then you look at the failure to fund this. And frankly, it's probably the thing which comes closest to driving me nuts, because, and I say this to all my fiscal conservative friends, you have got trillions of dollars of guaranteed expense sitting on the table. You're never going to get away from it. And you'll never have enough bureaucracy. I would say to my liberal friends, you'll never create a good enough centralized bureaucracy to rationally spend this money in a way, because in the end, you're going to have to cut off services. That's what happens. So if you don't want to cut off services to people who have very long problems like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or autism for a lifetime, if you want the breakthroughs, you got to be over here solving this. And I think being creative and being honest about it, I can get us to a federal balanced budget that's almost in perpetuity through health breakthroughs. There is no other strategy with the baby boomers aging that will get you to a sustainable balanced budget.
So,
By the way, one other thing, which you hinted at. And by the way, while we're doing that to save ourselves trillions of dollars, we'll create hundreds of thousands of very high-paying American jobs, and we will dramatically strengthen our balance of payments.
yes. So if Congress boosted NIH funding again, if we could come together and get an agreement to do that, how would you recommend that we structure this funding?
Well, first of all, without putting him absurdly on the spot, I would try to get Francis Collins to really reflect on the lessons from the Human Genome Project. I am not a big fan of the peer-reviewed small grant model. I think it leads to incrementalism. I think it leads to extraordinary caution. And I think it actually has not made progress on the scale. And I think this is one of the challenges we have in selling NIH to people, that when you double it, you want to see, so there, what's the rhythm, what's the excitement? It's a similar problem that NASA has, frankly. I mean, boredom is not a good device for getting people to be involved. The Human Genome Project was stunningly exciting. It was also done outside the traditional patterns. So I would really look carefully at 3 areas. One is, to what degree can we design much larger grant projects that are very driven towards goals, the way the Human Genome Project was. The second is, to what degree can a modest amount of money be put into prizes of a variety of forms. And there, if you look at the history of aviation, for example, it is amazing how much activity was stimulated by very modest prizes. Lindbergh flew the Atlantic for $25,000. And lots of people were trying simultaneously. And then third, I would say, we need to find a way to guarantee that a significant part of that money goes to younger researchers so that they have a chance to become principal researchers, not just serfs working for some senior position. Now, I will also, and I hesitate to do this because you represent the state that is probably the most affected, but I would love to have somebody have the courage to question the scale of money we give the universities for administering this stuff. I mean, you look at the percent that Harvard gets or Johns Hopkins gets. I'm actually at both of you in one line here.
Sure.
I'd love to see that looked at, just to say, come on, guys, can't more of that go straight into research?
So let me just ask you the question, though, on the funding part of this. Should we be doing, as we think about this, should we be doing capital budgeting as a way to increase the funding substantially for NIH? In order to fund NIH, do we have to cut short-term spending in other areas?
We don't have to cut short-term spending in other areas. That's why I would take it off budget and issue Alzheimer's bonds, because I think the long-term tidal wave that's coming is so enormous that the most fiscally prudent thing you could do is find a way to undercut that wave through research. So I'm happy to defend that notion anywhere in the country in terms of talking to conservatives, because there is no other alternative that works. Second, I do think if you look at how the Navy builds aircraft carriers, they technically can't put the money in because of the nature of federal appropriations process, so they can't buy the whole carrier, but they can sign a contract which makes it prohibitive to not complete the carrier. It's a very interesting, clever sleight of hand. I do think that we ought to find ways to fund fairly large projects over at least a 4 or 5 or 6 year period, so that people have not, and I understand, and again, I'm a constitutional conservative. I actually believe Congress ought to have pretty real control over things, but I also think there are practicalities. The Transcontinental Railroad could never have been built on an annual budget. So they had to design an incentive plan that enabled them to go get the capital over a multi-year period. And I do think, I would challenge though, and this puts some of my close friends in a bind, because they got to get this through OMB and the White House. I would challenge NIH to come back and say, if give us some projects so large and so exciting that they justify a capital budget, and then let's go fight for the capital budget.
So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, I feel like I'm standing here pitching low and slow over the plate, but I am very pleased to hear your answers. We have a gaping hole in the NIH budget. Right now, it's $12.5 billion. We need a serious plan to fix it. And if we really want to dream big about what we can create, then we need to get out here and fight for more funding for NIH. I've proposed a bill called the Medical Innovation Act, which would increase NIH funding by 20% without raising taxes, without cutting critical programs, and it doesn't even have to go off budget. If there are other ideas, then folks should put them on the table, but it is time to get this done. I think that it goes without saying that you and I have fundamental disagreements in some area, but it is clear that one thing we agree on is what Congress must do, and I hope that we will be able to follow your example, double the funding for NIH as you did in the 1990s, and bring home some of the promises of medical research in this country right now. Thank you. You had another comment?
Yeah, just one comment. Speaker Gingrich, I want to, again, thank you. And going back to some comments we were making before we started today, I'm hoping that you'll use your influence to help us achieve the things we have to achieve. As I was listening to you, I don't want something to go unnoticed. You know, you talked about key people who played significant roles in making sure that we had appropriate funding for research, and particularly medical research. And I often say that out of our pain comes our passion to do our purpose. And, you know, I think that the people that you talked about obviously had pain that they had experienced in their families, and they were able to take it to the halls of Congress and make a difference, not only perhaps for their families, but also for many others all around the world. And then I thought about what you said about how important, and Senator Warren was talking about how important this research is. I know I have a family member, 10 years ago, they said, well, they thought she had a terminal type cancer, but because of work at NIH, it's now chronic, you know? And so those are the things that we don't necessarily talk about when people are looking at dollars and cents and austerity, but those are the things that mean so much to so many people. And so I want to thank you again for being with us, and I'm hoping that you will join us on our crusade to lift up all Americans so that they can live the very best lives that they can. Thank you.
Let me just thank both of you for your leadership in doing this. These are the kind of conversations that ultimately in a free society allow it to talk to itself and to find dramatically higher value solutions. And I think what you two are doing is very, very important, and you have my commitment that anything I can do to help in this project, you can call on me and I will do everything I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let this be the start of a new alliance. Thank you, Speaker Gingrich. I'd like to ask our folks to set up for our second panel, and we invite the members of the second panel to take their places. Somebody doing setup? There we go. That's it.
Our first panelist is Dr. Carol Espy-Wilson, Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Maryland's A. James Clark School of Engineering. Dr. Espy-Wilson received her Ph.D. from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. An expert in speech communication, Dr. Espy-Wilson is a member of the National Advisory Board of Medical Rehabilitation at the National Institutes of Health. She is also the founder of the OmniSpeech, a company that is commercializing for use in cell phones a software technology to separate speech from background noise that was created through Dr. Espy-Wilson's research. Welcome.
And I'm very proud to have a chance to introduce our witness from Massachusetts. Dr. Aaron Kesselheim is an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and a faculty member in the division of, I always do this, pharmacoepidemiology and pharmacoeconomics at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, where he directs the program on regulation, therapeutics, and law. Dr. Kesselheim earned his bachelor's degree from Harvard University, his medical and law degrees from the University of Pennsylvania. He also earned his master's in public health from the Harvard School of Public Health. He is certified in internal medicine, and he serves as a primary care physician at the Phillips Center for Primary Care at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Welcome, Dr. Kesselheim. We are very pleased to have you today, and thank you for lending your expertise to this panel. And also, I am honored to welcome Dr. Mariana Mazzucato, who is the R.M. Phillips Chair in the Economics of Innovation at the Science Policy Research Unit of the University of Sussex. Dr. Mazzucato completed her Ph.D. in economics at the New School for Social Research in New York. She is the author of The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths, which was included in the 2013 Book of the Year list issued by the Financial Times. So thank each of you for being here, and if you could each just provide some opening remarks, and then we'll get started with questions. Dr. Espy-Wilson.
Sorry. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today to share my experience with federal investment in research and innovation. I've been a professor now for almost 25 years, and I've been able to sustain a research program with the support from the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. And I am in the process of commercializing technology that originated from this research program. And that effort, too, has been funded through small business innovative research grants from the National Science Foundation and a small business technology transfer research grant from the National Institutes of Health. I think it would be informative for this hearing to start by describing typically that the academic career track will start for some as a postdoc, and then on to an assistant professor, after about 5 to 6 years, on to an associate professor with tenure, and then typically after another 5 years, one may become a full professor. Now, if you're at a major research university, a significant part of your time as a professor is spent conducting research, which typically includes the training of graduate students as independent researchers, possibly some training of undergraduates, and this is becoming more and more important as we want to build a pipeline of students who are excited about research and ready for graduate school, particularly in the STEM fields, and then collaborations with colleagues inside and outside of your university to address problems that may span several disciplines. Even the combination of research and teaching is very important because professors are able to share their research in the classroom to help students understand how the subject matter they're learning can be applied to do analysis or to solve useful problems and to motivate them to seek a research career. As many have said here today, conducting basic research helps us to build an understanding of all sorts of matters, helps us to solve significant problems, develop useful technologies that can be transformative, and all the while training the next generation of scientists and engineers. The funding of basic research should be of highest priority. Basic research, which provides the foundation for advances that will benefit our children and grandchildren, is supported almost exclusively by the federal government. Both basic and applied research are valuable, but there are alternative sources of support for applied research. Without basic research, there is no applied research and no innovation. And federal cutbacks in this funding has been huge. Excellent and innovative research is not being funded. For example, at the NIH, and we've talked about them today, the funding percentile for scored proposals in some institutes is as low as 9%, whereas in 2001, it was as high as 29%. And this reduction in the number of proposals that are funded has had a significant negative impact on the morale of investigators, not just the ones who are applying for these grants, but also their peers who are seeing these excellent proposals not being funded. It also, of course, has a significant negative impact on the training of students and the degree to which fundamental research gets done. Young scientists and engineers are making other choices, career choices, and these are the very people we should encourage the most to do research because they are the next generation of drivers of innovation. For some, particularly like computer scientists and engineers, they can find interesting jobs, even research jobs in industry. However, many of our young scientists are headed into underemployment. Also, program officers are cutting budgets significantly because they are trying to spread the wealth, but that causes considerable disruption in the research and the training of students. In particular, one of the first things you will cut is your travel budget, but then that doesn't allow you to send students to conference so that they can develop the job prospects that they need. Cutting back in funding also is having a negative impact of making agencies more conservative in the research they will support. As a result, there are no incentives, encouragement, and financial support of faculty, postdocs, and students towards out-of-the-box and creative ways of thinking. In real terms, while government-supported research is shrinking here in the US, it is growing in most of Europe and Asia. And we're seeing this a lot based on this sort of research that's being presented at conferences. This trend begs the question of where will the big breakthroughs and discoveries made in the future come from? Finally, I'm sure you're aware of the existing problem of too few U.S. students going into STEM fields. I fear that federal cutbacks will only make this problem worse. And I feel confident in saying that in most research universities, it is already the case that our graduate student population, particularly at the Ph.D. level in STEM areas, consists of mainly mostly foreign students, not Americans. And we need to look for ways to turn this deficit around. So investments in research and education have a huge return, but only over a long time span. These are investments we make not necessarily for ourselves in the short term, but for our children and grandchildren. It's sometimes not easy to think that far ahead, but it is imperative that we do so. Now I would like to address the translation of research from the lab to a startup for commercialization. The research that is being translated at my company, OmniSpeech, was supported by multiple NSF and NIH grants as part of my research program at the University of Maryland. I did not conduct this research initially with an eye toward commercialization. After disclosing the invention of our algorithm to the patent office and giving some talks at research review days, I got a lot of feedback and a lot of encouragement to do a company, and that began my foray into entrepreneurship. In addition to the fact that the University of Maryland at College Park has a very active entrepreneurship incubation program, it was of the utmost importance to me that the Small Business Innovative Research and Small Business Technology Transfer programs existed. For OmniSpeech, the NSF SBIR grant was the critical catalyst for beginning the effort to transform original research code into a commercially viable solution. It enabled me to hire our first DSP engineers and to reach out to prospective partners for evaluation. Moreover, as a tiny startup, it was critical for establishing credibility. Finally, the promise of additional matching funds through the Phase 2B program was pivotal in securing third-party angel investment that allowed us to further expand the team as we prepared for commercialization. The government must continue to provide incentives to spur innovation and support the development of new technologies, as these efforts in turn lead to expanded employment, the growth of the middle class, and improvements of our quality of life. Fortunately, the SBIR and the STTR programs are doing well. NSF has raised in the last couple of years the funding amounts for the Phase 2 awards from $500,000 to $750,000, and this is significant and will help startups considerably, especially since commercializing technology can take a lot of effort, resources, and time. In my case, given it was research code that we were starting with, that code was computationally very expensive. And we had to optimize that code to make it run many times faster than real time to fit on a DSP chip. So it took us a lot longer to do this task than we ever imagined because we never had to commercialize code before. I also want to point out that the NSF has also developed the I-Corps program. And the primary goal of this program is to foster entrepreneurship, that is, preparing engineers and scientists to extend their focus beyond the laboratory in the commercialization of technology that has been supported previously by NSF-funded research. And this program has already been shown to make a significant difference in the success rates of these companies because they also are fostering an ecosystem where they're surrounding or wrapping around these companies, mentors, angel investors, venture capitalists, and marrying these scientists and engineers with CEOs, people who already have a lot of business acumen and can really help them get to the next level in their company. Some of these companies, this program has only existed for 2 or 3 years, and some of them have already achieved huge success, where they're licensing a lot of technology or their companies have even been bought out by Google or Facebook or someone else. So,
Dr. Espy-Wilson, could I just ask you to wrap up so we're sure we get to everybody?
So
this is really great.
That was the last part, was to just highlight that on the entrepreneurship side, the federal government is doing well, but just remembering that we have to start with the basic research to get to that point.
Good. Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Kesselheim.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thank you. It's my pleasure today to talk to you a little bit about my research in the sources of transformative medicines. The holy grail of drug research and development are transformative medicines, innovative drugs that have a groundbreaking effect on patient care. Policymakers, physicians, and especially patients have worried about a reduction in the number of new such products despite an increasingly cost-intensive drug development process. To best encourage transformative new drugs, it's important to direct policies towards the sources of these products, but there's controversy over the importance of different contributors to the process of developing therapeutics. The pharmaceutical industry has contended that its research leads to the development of most new medicines, while arguing that public institutions like NIH support medical innovation that is distinct from the process of drug development. While the contribution of industry-based research to drug development remains vital, I want to focus my comments today on the valuable yet under-recognized role played by public investment. To inform this discussion, I led a survey of national clinical leaders in over a dozen different medical specialties to determine what they thought were the most transformative drugs that have been approved by the FDA in the last 25 years. The experts came to a consensus over a final list of 26 drugs and drug classes, and I then examined the development history of each of these drugs. A full result of our investigations are available in papers that we published in journals like Health Affairs and Nature Reviews Drug Discovery, among others. But one of the major recurrent themes was publicly funded academic or government scientists conceptualizing a therapeutic approach based on basic research about disease mechanisms, and then even going so far as to demonstrate proof of concept. For example, the red blood stimulator erythropoietin was first purified at the University of Chicago laboratory of Eugene Goldwasser in 1971, who also proved its potential therapeutic effect. With Goldwasser's help as a consultant, Amgen researchers cloned the gene over a decade later and produced large quantities of recombinant epigen, leading to its 1989 approval to treat anemia. Imatinib, or Gleevec, the first effective treatment for a rare type of leukemia, was also the first very successful targeted cancer therapy. It arose based on the work of Brian Drucker at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, who set out to prove the concept that tyrosine kinase inhibitors could inhibit the malfunctioning enzyme. When Drucker applied selections from Ciba-Geigy's drug laboratory for activity in a laboratory model he and his colleagues had developed, he identified imatinib as an active agent. Or zidovudine, Retrovir, the first product to demonstrate inhibition of HIV. It was synthesized many decades ago at the Karmanos Cancer Institute in Michigan. But in 1984, with the rising threat of HIV, Sam Broder at NCI solicited drug submissions from companies for possible antiviral candidates. Zidovudine was submitted among hundreds of other drugs, and Broder and his colleagues documented activity against the virus far higher than any other compound. Clinical trials were begun promptly at NIH in collaborations with Burroughs Wellcome and clinicians at Duke University, and zidovudine was FDA approved a scant 3 years later. One variation on this theme for some drugs, the seminal scientific concepts first arose in university settings and were later followed up in an industry setting. An example of this variation can be found in the discovery of SSRI antidepressants. Arvid Carlsson and his colleagues at the University of Lund in Sweden investigated serotonin's role in depression in the 1960s. They synthesized the first SSRI, Zimelidine, and showed its selective effects on serotonin neurons and its efficacy in treating depression. Around that same time, a research team at Lilly started designing and testing fluoxetine, the first SSRI to be FDA approved. The transformative medications in our samples treated different conditions were discovered by a variety of institutions, yet one similarity emerged among many of these transformative products: the centrality of publicly funded, government and academic-based innovators in the development work. Drug companies play a vital role in the development of new drugs. For example, collaborations might occur between academic collaborators and industry collaborators who provide drug samples or other technical and scientific support to move forward a seminal discovery, but our findings do not support the concept of the pharmaceutical industry as the single most important source of transformative drug development. Though our survey only included drugs through 2009, further support for the essential results can be found in the story behind another most recent transformative drug, sofosbuvir, or Sovaldi, the first direct-acting antiviral treatment for hepatitis C. The story of sofosbuvir starts with decades of investment that federal government has made in understanding HIV since its discovery, with grants to build virology labs and discover drugs and conduct trials. One of the recipients was Ray Shinazi, the director of the Lab for Biochemical Pharmacology at Emory and a senior research scientist at the VA, an expert in nucleoside chemistry who formed a startup called Pharmacet to develop nucleoside drugs to treat hepatitis C virus, eventually hitting on sofosbuvir. As with the concept of the usefulness of nucleoside viral inhibitors in HCV, many of the key insights underlying the drugs identified in our survey arose in academic or government-sponsored settings. However, these concepts are not patentable, since ownership under patent law is generally reserved for products. The commercial development of products based on these insights and the ownership of the resulting intellectual property often occurs within the pharmaceutical company. This leads to misperceptions about the relative importance of the different sources' contribution of these products. One of the outcomes of the misperception about the origin of transformative drugs is that proposals to promote drug innovation often focus on providing greater incentives for drug producers by extending patents or reducing regulatory barriers for approval. And as an example of this, you can see the bad half of the recent 21st Century Cures legislation passed by the House of Representatives. In contrast, reductions for NIH funding have threatened the sources that we found actually did support most transformative drug innovation. So I firmly believe that policies that support federal investments in science and innovation will be powerful ways of producing more transformative drugs in the future. However, this assumption by the federal budget of the high-risk, high-cost aspects of basic research may lead to widely new therapies that have raised concern as to whether this could lead to the socialization of risk and the privatization of profit in drug development. So we should also think about other ways that the public can gain from this investment, such as returning a small share of the revenues to the public infrastructure by being plowed back into more NIH-funded research. But as demonstrated by its significant role in creating transformative drugs over the past 25 years, publicly funded research holds great promise for further advancing transformative drug development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kesselheim. And Dr. Mazzucato.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a real honor, and it's especially wonderful because I must say that this is one of the only topics that economists agree about. So it is more or less commonly agreed that, spending on R&D, which of course we should always remember is just one of the inputs into the innovation process, have an absolutely very important effect on long-run economic growth. But the real issue, and this is where we then get back into the sort of debates between economists, is how do we actually talk about this? What really is, for example, the role of the public sector when it interacts with business, with industry, with the private sector in nurturing the innovation economy. And there we have a real problem, and I think I really want to focus on how the limited way that economists have talked about this have also really limited also the way that policymakers have feel enabled, if you want, to also increase the budgets, whether it's of the NIH, NSF, or even NASA. And, it's not a coincidence that I work at SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, which was founded in 1965, because it was really one of the only places that really sort of head-on confronted this notion that economists have that the role of the public sector in financing innovation is simply to fix market failures. And, of course, we've heard a lot here about basic research, but it's not just about basic research. The public sector has been absolutely fundamental for financing innovation across the whole innovation chain. And I was really happy to hear Speaker Gingrich say the word market shaping, because in fact, if you look at what NIH, NASA, DARPA, ARPA, SVR have really enabled in the US has been really market creation and market shaping through a decentralized network of very active, strategic, and mission-oriented public agencies. And the problem is in economics, we really don't even have the words to talk about market shaping and market creating. So we talk about the public good, and of course basic research is a public good. Why is it a public good? Because the spillovers, when it happens, are just so high that it's very hard for a private firm to appropriate the returns from that, and hence you get underinvestment from private companies in basic research, and so the government has to step in. But again, if you look at places like Silicon Valley or places of innovation across the United States, what you've really seen is different types of actors across the whole innovation chain investing in basic research, applied research, and also, as we were hearing before, in the kind of patient finance that early stage companies require, because if you know anything about venture capital, you know that they're very exit driven. They want their returns in 3, maximum 5 years. That exit tends to happen either through a buyout or an IPO, and that's fine maybe for some gadgets, but it's not going to get you the biotech revolution, the nanotech revolution, the internet revolution, or today's clean tech revolution that so many people are hoping for. And so I really want to focus on those points and how the inability to talk about this, we have a discursive problem, as Tony Judt used to say, has also, again, really hurt policymaking in this area. So I've already said that, lots of these agencies have not been there just to fix market failures. They've been mission-oriented, right? I mean, the most obvious mission, of course, was going to the moon. But if you read ARPA-E's website today, they very clearly have a mission to, nurture out-of-the-box thinking around renewable energy innovation. If you look at the NIH website, it's absolutely mission-oriented. And again, how do we include missions and visions in econometric models? We don't. So beware of those econometric tests, which look at, what the public sector should be doing. But also, if you look at sort of the 3 big problems that we have today, which is, first of all, the cuts that we're witnessing in research altogether. So, the latest figure is that federal spending on R&D as a percentage of total R&D was peaking at around 67% in the 60s. It's dropped to 20 to 25% in the years in the 2000s. Recently, it's gone back up to 30% because of ARA, which is great. However, it's, this is a massive fall. It's also increasingly focused just on basic research. And while it's wonderful that we, again, are talking about basic research and the importance of it today, we have to remember that the big successes in the past really came from nurturing also these linkages, fundamental dynamic linkages between basic and applied research. We have if you just look at the aggregate figures, it looks like the private sector is making up for that. That was one of the questions that you were asking before to the Speaker Gingrich. However, that has been increasingly around applied research. So the private sector used to spend something like 35% of total basic research spending was in the private sector. Now it has fallen to about 20%, and it's increasingly narrow in scope. And this has actually co-evolved alongside a real dysfunctionality we have today in, unfortunately, many countries, but especially in the US, which is an increasing financialization of companies, so spending more on things like share buybacks and on R&D. And this is really fundamental, because when we look at, those times, if you want, when you had an active private sector engaging with an active mission-oriented strategic public sector, you have to ask yourselves, why were they doing that? And so Bell Labs, which we often hear about as having been so fundamental, it actually came from a deal with government, right? AT&T was a big monopoly. Government said, fine, well, you can retain your monopoly status as long as you reinvest your profits back into big innovations. And they did, and Bell Labs was the answer to that kind of provocation. We really don't have, if you want, that kind of deal-making today between the public and private actors. And partly, I think, this is really because we've allowed this narrative to be just so pervasive that the only thing that the public sector has to do is sort of, facilitate, de-risk, create the conditions for innovation, and then all the really cool stuff is going to actually happen within business. And the problem is that is just historically incorrect. We've always required a dynamic, creative, strategic public sector alongside business, and I really hope we get to talking about that, because as long as we just talk about basic research, we kind of miss that whole wider story.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Mazzucato. So let me start with the question about where innovation comes from. If we want to improve medical innovation, for example, then we need first to understand where the discoveries come from. One analysis found that 2/3 of the 21 drugs with the highest therapeutic impact approved between 1965 and 1992 stemmed directly from discoveries made through publicly funded research. Dr. Kesselheim, you found in a recent study that most of our truly transformative drugs are based on insights gained through publicly funded research, something you've summarized in your testimony here today. But a 2001 health affairs study found that is often cited by the drug industry, found that 91% of drug patents are owned by the private sector, and the industry says this is evidence that innovation comes straight from the drug companies. So, Dr. Kesselheim, I just want you to help us understand the discrepancy in these two descriptions of where innovation comes from.
Well, I think there are a number of explanations as to why it is that health affairs study might have found that. First of all, as I said in my comments, a lot of the key insights, such as the use of tumor necrosis factor blockers to treat rheumatologic disease, that really then inspire a whole field of therapeutics, are not necessarily patentable insights, but nonetheless arise from decades, in the case of the VEGF inhibitors and Avastin story, decades of government-funded research that is usually conducted in government laboratories or in the academic center, and those kinds of key insights that then catalyze the subsequent development of products are not patentable, although the products then are. On the other hand, pharmaceutical companies do an excellent job of trying to build a patent thicket around their inventions, and then will subsequently patent, incremental changes and incremental innovations, and so will, build we did one study showing, over 200 patents around a one particular drug. So I think that on the one hand, it's the case that a lot of the key innovations that come from public money are not patentable. On the other hand, it's the case that pharmaceutical companies pursue patents to excess. We did a study looking at all of these patents that are held in the healthcare sector, and found that the very small sliver of patents that were held by by academic institutions and government were actually much more important in terms of being cited more in subsequent patents and had much more impact on the field in terms of their generalizability and value than the patents on average that were held by the pharmaceutical sector.
So the federal government invests a lot of money in research. The drug companies then use that research to develop new drugs. And then when those drugs earn money, sometimes billions of dollars, the taxpayers don't necessarily reap the reward. That's how I'm hearing you describe this chain. Now, some drug companies argue that the government recoups its investment in basic research because the drug companies pay corporate taxes on their profits. Do you believe that the taxpayers are being adequately compensated for their investment in the drug companies, Dr. Kesselheim?
Well, I mean, I think that we could do a lot more to try to invest some of the positive profits and outcomes that come from these products into the into the biomedical enterprise specifically. When you look at pharmaceutical manufacturers and you look at how much money they devote to research and development, only 20% of pharmaceutical manufacturers' sales are devoted to research and development. The amount that they spend on administration and advertising is actually far more. And then the amount that they spend on actual innovative research and development is far less than that, on the level of less than 5%. So I think that what we need to be doing is considering ways of taking some of the enormous profits that emerge from the pharmaceutical industry and plowing them back into the biomedical enterprise that in many cases provided the underlying discoveries that allowed those profits to be made.
Well, in fact, though, I think there's much conversation about going in the opposite direction with drug company profits. Perhaps I could get you involved in this, Dr. Mazzucato. There's a lot of talk now about cutting corporate taxes for companies that can trace their profits back to patents or other forms of intellectual property. So I want to know what you think about this sort of innovation box tax cut. Would it spur innovation or increase federal investments in research? Dr. Mazzucato, you have a point of view about this?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important that we remember what a patent is. And a patent is a monopoly for 20 years, right? So as a policymaker, the goal should not be to increase, the profits of companies. It should be actually to increase the research, if you want, that leads to those patents, right? This is what policymakers are trying to do all around the world. And the evidence is that these patent box or innovation box type policies are not very good at that, because what they're targeting is the income generated from the patents rather than the research that leads to them. This is also true, by the way, of lots of R&D tax credits, which end up being designed very poorly. In Holland, they've just designed one which is actually quite intelligent, I think, because it's targeting the research that leads to the R&D, so the labor hired, again, rather than the income generated from that R&D. But I think we should also remember that, for example, the Bayh-Dole Act, which in 1980 allowed publicly funded research to be patented, if you actually read that act, it's really interesting. I mean, they also say we better make sure that the taxpayer doesn't pay twice, right? So just last year, I think the NIH spent around 31 billion in research, both basic and applied. And the problem is, what happens to also the prices of these drugs? Do they reflect that sort of input, right? And so it's not only, and I've been actually writing a lot about this, how we might get some sort of plowback measures, but even the pricing mechanism itself could be one way that the taxpayer could be rewarded, precisely so they don't pay twice. But the government has never felt the confidence, if you want, to exercise that right to cap the prices of drugs, precisely because of this wrong narrative that I was talking about before, where this idea that you're meddling in the market when actually you've created that market. You've just given us so much evidence where this kind of financing has actually shaped the healthcare industry, the actual drugs that are purchased. But as soon as we talk about government having a say on the price, or even the whole Obamacare, if you want, vision, we hear about the government meddling in the healthcare industry. And so this is why we need a new narrative.
So what I'm hearing you say, if I just boil this down a little bit, is that we get more innovation if we plow more into basic research, if we do more federal support for basic research, not if we make these giveaways to big drug companies.
No, there's no evidence. So the patent box, which has been tried and tested in places, like the UK, there's no evidence that that increases investment in innovation. It might increase time that people golf. I don't know. That might happen. That could be tested as well. But what drives investments in innovation by the private sector are their perceptions of where the future technological and market opportunities are. By the way, Warren Buffett is very good on this.
Good.
And then I think what we're talking about is what actually drives those future opportunities. And that's what we should be talking about. That's what policymakers should be thinking about, actually financing those opportunities, because that's what drives private sector investment.
And so I'm just going to do one more question, then hand it over to the Congressman, and that is then to ask about the impact of something like my Medical Innovation Act, which could boost the NIH budget by about 20% without adding new taxes, without adding to the deficit, by asking the drug companies to put a little more of their profits into NIH. No surprise, the army of lobbyists that work for the biggest drug companies don't like this bill. But Dr. Kesselheim, could I ask you how the Medical Innovation Act might affect the pipeline of new products and affect the drug industry itself?
Well, I think that the Medical Innovation Act is a good idea because it will, it provides a very substantial sum to the NIH for its work in catalyzing transformative drug development, and to the FDA for its work in supporting regulatory science to make sure drugs are evaluated and approved so that we know that they work and are safe before they can come on the market. So I think that unfortunately the amount of money that pharmaceutical companies have made over false advertising and other problems that they've had that has led to a substantial amount of money that they could be contributing back into the development economy through this Medical Innovation Act.
Well, I thank you very much. And it's clear from the testimony we've heard today that new drugs are built on a foundation of taxpayer-supported investments in basic research. It does not make sense to me that Congress says that it wants more innovation and then turns around and cuts the budgets for NIH, for NSF, for our basic research. It is time for lawmakers to put their money where their mouth is. I think that the Medical Innovation Act is one way that we could help get back on the right track. So thank you all. Congressman Cummings?
Yes, Dr. Espy-Wilson, the journey from lab to market certainly involves many steps and is a perilous one that many technologies and discoveries, even some of the most promising ones, have not succeeded in making. Is that right? Some of them don't make it.
No, thank you.
And for that reason, it's my understanding the space between the lab and market is often called the valley of death.
Mm-hmm.
You're in the process of taking a software technology
Mm-hmm.
that you developed through your research out of the lab and into the commercial market. Just a few questions. Your firm, OmniSpeech, has received several small business innovation research grants from the National Science Foundation. How important have those SBIR grants been to enabling OmniSpeech to cross the so-called valley of death?
Well, I hope we've crossed it, but we're well on our way to if we haven't. But critical. I mean, I would not have started the company in the first place if those grants didn't exist. Being a professor, I know how to write proposals. It's something that we do all the time. And so having that there made it a lot easier. But I'll also add that University of Maryland has been very supportive to professors, students, forming companies, and so has developed a lot of programs. And one crucial program for me was a program called the Venture Accelerator that I joined, where you have people with a lot of business acumen who have been entrepreneurs several times. They're there to advise you, to help you write a business plan, to help you develop a financial model, to really help you think like a business person, because that's very different from thinking like a professor. Mm-hmm.
In other words, that goes to effectiveness and efficiency of what you're doing.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
I mean, sometimes I think you have people that go out there and they are trying to reinvent the wheel, and they don't know how to do it.
Yes.
And the next thing you know, they fall in the ditches, and they never get back up. They become discouraged, and next thing you know, they're on the sidelines.
Yes, and so that's also the goal of the I-Corps program that NSF has also developed. Again, that came after I had started, so I wasn't able to take advantage of that program. But one of the main things that they have people who are thinking of being entrepreneurs do is to test the market, to actually go out and talk to your potential customers, to your potential strategic partners, and understand what is the market need. Yeah. Because oftentimes we develop technology because we think it's really great, only to find that there's no one that really wants that technology. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure you don't waste that time. And they've been able to reduce the possibility of that happening significantly.
How important is venture capital funding to getting that technology to market?
Depends on how much money you have. If you're able to generate revenue very early, then you may not need to get venture capital funding if you can get enough revenue coming in early. But if it's going to take considerable amount of time to get that kind of traction where you're generating millions of dollars that can really support all of your employees and your growth, then you need venture capital.
You said something that I don't want it to go unnoticed. You talked about how when these younger people cannot get grants to go into do research, you said they often become underemployed. And Senator Warren and I have been looking at this whole middle class prosperity situation. And you know, the idea that we had one hearing where where we talked about people being saddled with debt. Mm-hmm. I mean, students coming out of school saddled with debt. And so then we have a situation here where if they don't have opportunities, then they don't have a job to even pay the debt.
Exactly.
And I have even gotten to the giving, the feeling probably of hopelessness and wasted possibilities that, they could be giving these great gifts to the world. And that's something that, we just kind of, I don't want us to pass by that because we've got a lot of young people who want to go out there and do great things. Mm-hmm. But unless we open these doors, and Senator Warren talks about it a lot, about how all of this, allows us to create jobs. That's very significant. Do you see that? I mean, do you see young people, you're a professor, do you see young people kind of falling by the wayside or becoming discouraged?
Very much so, yes, definitely. And especially even the young scientists who are trained and are able to apply for proposals through NIH. I mean, I think there's research that shows it's the young investigators that are hurt the most because they don't have the track record that your more established scientists have. And unfortunately, when you're sitting there in a peer review panel, the more established scientists, what they're capable of. They tend to, in my opinion, get favored a lot of times over the young investors because they don't have a proven track record.
And we're also cutting off our pipeline of people going into
when we're
the future.
doing that. And so they do try to make efforts at NIH to give special attention to young investigators. Mm-hmm. But there's still a lot of them who end up without support.
And Dr. Mazzucato, in your book, The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myth, you discuss how the U.S., and I quote, has one of the most interventionist governments when it comes to innovation. If the government no longer played the role of mission setter, is there any other force in the United States capable of making what President Kennedy called the national commitment of scientific and technical manpower, material, and facilities to marshal our nation's capabilities and talents to solve our biggest challenges?
Well, no. I mean, I think that the point is not, do we need, just the state and not the private sector, or more private or more public? It's always been a very, important, dynamic, public-private, if you want, interactions that have been absolutely fundamental to creating the kinds of innovations that have been fundamental to U.S. economic growth. The problem is that today we have real crisis on both sides. So we don't have that mission-oriented, or if you want, we have less confidence for many agencies even to talk about their missions. They have to show their economic value. They themselves are becoming short-termists sometimes, like the private sector. But also, you know, when we think about these SBIR funds, for example, which you were just talking about, in some ways what they were able to do in the past were to act kind of like a public VC fund, which, by the way, is very common around the world. So Israel has YASMA, Finland has Citra. You know, this is not about communism. This is about how to get, you know, capitalist investments in innovation. But the problem is that by not allowing them to talk about themselves in a particular way, we haven't actually allowed them also to do what any normal venture capitalist will do, which is also to welcome failure. Right? I mean, when you try to innovate, you will fail and fail and fail again. Michael Jordan, I think, has one of the best quotes on that. And so, but what the private venture capitalists have is they have ability to reap some of the reward on the upside, which you were talking about before, to also cover that downside investment, right? All the failures. And so, you know, again, this lack of ability to admit, yes, we actually are kind of like a public venture capital fund, has also not allowed, say, SBIR, but I would definitely argue NIH and DARPA, to think much more concretely about how to create, let's say, a revolving fund. And you even see this with, say, the recent guaranteed loans that were given to companies like Tesla and Solyndra. Everyone knows the Solyndra story. Why? Because it failed. It was a great story for anyone who wanted to bash government, right? Government should not be picking companies. They should just do kind of the background, leveling the playing field conditions, when actually everything behind the iPhone that we know, was actually picked, internet, GPS, touchscreen display, Siri. They were all picked, actually, by different government institutions for financing. And so if we admit that, for each internet, you'll get 20 Concords, for each Tesla, you'll get 20 Solyndras, then we should actually start thinking much more concretely, not just about how these agencies should be able to be confident about their missions, but precisely in order to do these investments again and again, and not just have these one-shot deals, they have to get much more realistic about whether the tax system by its own, if you want, is actually bringing back enough money to do these experiments again and again.
Let me ask you a question about China. The Bachelet 2014 Global R&D Funding Forecast reported that China was continuing to make double-digit increases in its annual R&D budget. Bachelet projected that if this rate of growth continued through the end of the decade, China could surpass the U.S. in total R&D spending by about 2022. Is China trying to emulate the R&D model that we utilize in the U.S., and is it trying to entice researchers and new technologies to leave the United States to come to China?
Well, China, I think, has an incredible ability to adapt and to actually learn, in some ways, the right lessons when it looks around the world. And I think they definitely learned this lesson about the mission-oriented investments. I mean, they're spending $1.7 trillion on these 5 new sectors, which are really broadly defined. So it's not a narrow industrial policy. It's very much mission-oriented policy, mainly around green, by the way. If you look at these 5 areas, they're all kind of in that green direction. They're also increasing massively their R&D expenditures. But I think what's also interesting is those countries around the world that are able to see that as an opportunity as opposed to a threat. So Denmark, small country, is the #1 provider of high-tech services to China's green economy. And Denmark is both sort of pushing its weight in terms of investments and innovation in green on the manufacturing side, but because they themselves have also done this in this mission-oriented way, have been able to engage with China in this very interesting way that really sees these Chinese investments, again, as an opportunity. And I think what would be absolutely transformational for the U.S. is to stop seeing China as a threat in terms of, oh God, they're increasing their R&D investments much more than we are. They're doing this, that, the other, and actually ask themselves how they can benefit from this massive increase in spending, because they're also potentially supplying a demand side pull, not just the kind of supply side push, which in some ways we've all been talking about supply side pushes on innovation. And that's a really important point that maybe I should just say something quickly on, which is all the big technological revolutions in the US also required a demand side policy, right? So mass production big technological revolution would not have had the effect that it did in transforming productivity across the whole U.S. economy without also really big thinking, mission-oriented, demand-side policies around things like suburbanization. And one way I think that China today is thinking about that is precisely using green as a new direction also for the IT revolution, right? So you not just spend on IT, on high-tech, spend on R&D on high-tech areas, but you also think of how are you actually going to help the diffusion and the deployment of those new innovations across the whole economy. And green becomes a very interesting, I think, direction through which to think about, how even in this country we can allow IT to finally get fully deployed, as many people, including Robert Solow, are famous for saying there's computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics.
Senator Warren.
Thank you. So I think the data make it clear that to create real innovation, we need more investment in basic research. But right now, instead, Congress is focused on lowering the FDA's standards for approval so that companies can get their products on the market faster. The industry argues that patients just aren't getting new drugs fast enough and it's too hard for them to get drugs approved. I think this is a very dangerous game. So I just want to ask a question about this. Dr. Kesselheim, can you tell us about the authority the FDA already has to speed innovative new drugs to market, and if the FDA is using that authority?
Sure. There are a number of pathways that the FDA has to provide patients with access to important new drugs treating serious or life-threatening conditions or meeting unmet medical need. There are at least 5 different pathways that have the effect of or the intent of trying to speed new cures to market. And last year, approximately 2/3 of all the drugs approved by the FDA were approved via one of these accelerated development or review pathways. So not only does the FDA have these pathways already in place, but it is using them quite liberally. And actually, if you look at the statistics, a lot of new drugs are being approved on the basis of studies in treating biomarkers or other surrogate endpoints. About half of new drugs are being approved on the basis of surrogate endpoints now. Most new drugs are approved on the basis of studies in 6 months or less, despite the fact that they're intended to be for chronic diseases and used for a lifetime. So I think that the actual statistics and data don't support the industry's assertion that there is a very long and arduous process for testing or proving new drugs once it's known that those drugs work. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
Well, that's very helpful. Lowering FDA standards may make drug companies even more profitable, but it is not going to make them more innovative. So let me ask you another question about this. Some of the proposals put forward in Congress would allow drug makers to advertise and promote uses for their drugs that aren't approved by the FDA, these so-called off-label uses, that have only initial clinical evidence that they might work, like maybe a case study or a retrospective analysis or very small trial. Dr. Kesselheim, as an expert, can you explain how innovation and safety would be affected if these proposals were passed into law?
Yeah, these proposals are very dangerous for patients and for public health. What they do is they would allow companies to get drugs approved on the basis of an extremely narrow, limited indication and then promote them widely for conditions where they might not be effective and they may be unsafe because there hasn't been any testing done in them. Patients want transformative innovations. They want treatments for their conditions, but they want treatments that work, and they want treatments that are safe. They don't just want innovation for the sake of innovation. And if you don't if you don't provide companies with a requirement to do those kinds of tests by virtue of having the FDA approve those conditions, then companies historically, as we've seen throughout the U.S. history, companies won't do them. So you're not going to get the kind of testing that we need in order to guide physicians trying to prescribe these drugs, to guide patients who are looking for these drugs. We don't know how we wouldn't know how to use them or whether they'd be working. And meanwhile, because all these drugs are invariably expensive, we'd be dumping tons and tons of resources into these treatments that aren't well known. When what we could be doing is testing them first to make sure that they work, and then using them appropriately.
Yeah, that's a very powerful point. The FDA is the gold standard around the world because it has protected the safety of Americans and it has ensured that the drugs that are approved are in fact effective. We could dismantle the FDA, but lower standards wouldn't produce any new cures, and it certainly wouldn't keep us any safer. If we're serious about finding new cures, then Congress should better fund the FDA so that the FDA can do its work. We need to make a real commitment of real dollars here. So thank you very much. Congressman?
Yes. Dr. Kesselheim, according to Medicare and Medicaid data, between July 2013 and June 2014, at least 1,200 generic drugs more than doubled in price. Are you aware of this?
Yes.
There's one generic drug called naloxone that can reverse the effects of opioid or heroin overdose in just a few minutes. It has become vitally important for first responders, law enforcement, and healthcare workers. According to the CDC, heroin-related overdoses nearly quadrupled over the last decade. And yet, the company that makes naloxone in the nasal formula, most commonly used by first responders, increased its prices across the country by more than 50% over the past year. In Baltimore, where I live, the cost of naloxone more than doubled in less than 1 year. Dr. Kesselheim, are you aware of these price hikes?
Yes.
The only explanation for these price increases seems to be that this company sees the increase in demand for naloxone, and it sees the lack of competition, and is increasing its prices to make additional profits. This year, I introduced the Medicaid Generic Drug Price Fairness Act. This bill would require generic drug manufacturers to pay rebates to state Medicaid programs when drug prices increase faster than inflation. Under the current law, brand name drugs already pay these rebates. My bill would simply extend the same requirement to generic drugs so that they are treated equally. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that this change would save taxpayers $1 billion over the 10 years. Do you think this proposal makes any sense?
Well, first of all, absolutely. I think it's great that we're talking about generic drugs in a meeting on innovation, because one of the key principles towards drug innovation is that, sure, we need a period of market exclusivity in which a brand name company can make back its invested revenue. But what really drives innovation is when that market exclusivity period ends and then there is generic drugs available on the market and a vibrant generic drug marketplace in order to compete with the brand name companies, and that forces them to then pursue the next great thing. And in this case, it seems like there's a major market failure in the case of being able to provide these generic drugs for reasonable prices. And we need, substantial attention to this particular case, the naloxone case, as well as the many other cases that I know you've looked into and that others have looked into about, generic drugs that have been increasing in price. And I think that, your bill is a good step in the right direction, but I think there are a lot of also other things that could be done to try to make sure that there is a vibrant generic drug marketplace to try to promote innovation in both brand name and generic drugs.
A lot of people don't realize it, Dr. Kesselheim, but there are hospitals, according to the American Hospital Association, over 90% of all hospitals are suffering from drug shortages. And a lot of this is that folks are hoarding drugs and then jacking up the price, and selling it over and over again, and creating situations where a lot of hospitals cannot get first-rate drugs. Are you aware of that?
I am. It's very wasteful. A lot of these drugs are old drugs. There's no intellectual property covering them. This is a problem of the lack of attention that I think that our society has spent on on making sure that there's a vibrant generic drug market. And policies that can help ensure that these kinds of shortages are addressed in a timely fashion. I think the FDA has taken some steps internally in it, but I think that they could use a lot more attention and resources like the kind that you're trying to bring to it.
Well, I can tell you we're going to continue to shine a spotlight on this, but because again, going back to this project that Senator Warren and I are involved in, we're trying to figure out how do the middle class and others keep more of their paychecks. They're paying more and more for the basics of life, yet and producing more, but yet and still they're not getting paid more. And then they see the paycheck that they're getting it's shrinking, and they don't know, they're trying to figure out how to make ends meet, and they can't see a future even for their children. That is a future where their children do better than what they did. And so, again, it's all a part. It's so amazing how all of this comes together, and how every aspect, again, is hitting that middle class over and over again. And I got to tell you, people are tired. And many of them are throwing up their hands, trying to figure out what can we do to make their lives better. And this is an effort in that regard. Senator Warren?
So I just want to thank you all for being here today. Dr. Espy-Wilson, thank you and good luck making it through on the project. Dr. Kesselheim, thank you for bringing your research here and talking with us about it. Dr. Mazzucato, thank you very much, and thank you for reminding us that we need the right language to discuss this and expand some of our vision of what research really means and what it means to support research, how it changes our economy and our country. I think the key message here today has been that innovation is built on federally funded research. And Speaker Gingrich, we were delighted to have him here to talk about how in the 90s he was successful in doubling the NIH budget. And I was glad to hear him say today that he thought his only mistake was that he didn't triple the budget for the NSF. And I say 3 cheers for Speaker Gingrich on that. But since then, we have headed in the wrong direction. We have cut and cut and cut support for basic research. And this is a matter of the ultimate success of America's middle class. We need to support that research because we need to support good jobs here in America. We need to support that research because we need to make sure that America doesn't go bankrupt trying to deal with the medical problems of the future. So I want to thank everyone for being here today. Congressman Cummings, you have a final comment here?
One
Thank
thing.
you all.
You know, it's interesting when President Obama was in Kenya, I sat up at 5 o'clock in the morning and watched his speech. And one of the things that he said it was one of my favorite quotes. He says, "We do not inherit what we have from and it's mainly our environment and our opportunities from our ancestors. We borrow them from our children. We borrow them. The question is what are we going to provide for our children?" And when you look at research, making sure that people have the best medical care, making sure that we take advantage of innovation, making sure that we open the door for jobs, good jobs, jobs here in the United States that have an impact all over the world. It's all connected. It's all connected to what we're trying to do here today. And you all have contributed greatly to our discussion. We're going to take what you've said and use it in every way that we can. We'll probably be calling on you again, trying to get your advice, seeking your advice, because, again, we want the best minds, and we have them sitting in front of us. And we also, of course, thank Speaker Gingrich for his contributions. And, again, thank you very much as we march forward, trying to make a difference. My mom used to say, in my time and in my space, I will make a difference with God's grace. And thank you very much.
Thank you.